couple of years ago, when I was writing part of a book about Julius Caesar, I did a Twitter poll where I asked people, do you think Julius Caesar was rightfully assassinated as a tyrant or brutally murdered? And 25% said they thought he was rightfully assassinated and kind of empathised with the conspirators, and 54% said that they thought he had been brutally and unfairly murdered, which I think is really interesting in terms of his legacy.
Some historians tend to consider Julius Caesar a dictator or a tyrant, in a sense, a sort of right-wing figure. But on the other side, Julius Caesar is a very important social reformer. It's a very complicated figure. It's not easy to define him.
Even to people who follow me, a person who never talks about war, he is seen as a good leader of some kind and somebody who did not deserve to die, rather than a tyrant who had taken over the Republic and made himself a monarch, and who had left his opposition with no other option than to kill him.
Julius Caesar was a typical representative of the most noble families of Rome. Caesar and his family actually boasted an origin from the goddess Venus herself. That's why Julius Caesar was called Divus, like the divine Julius Caesar.
A large part of his career is a traditional Roman politician with a traditional Roman career. He starts by being a priest. He buys his way into his first offices.
Members of the family of Julius Caesar were consuls, in the early republic, so they had a long tradition, in politics. But Julius Caesar had a very difficult start, because when he was a young man, the politician who took the power in Rome at the time was Sulla, who was an enemy of the family of Julius Caesar. So members of the family of Julius Caesar were actually banished from Rome. Their properties were confiscated.
He was put on a kill list, basically, and had to run away from Rome and join the army. He doesn't join as like a foot soldier. He's not like sharp. He joins kind of mid-level, and his real skill is being amazing at war, which is a terrible and terrifying skill. And then he comes back to Rome with all of the money that he gets by plundering places that Romans are plundering, and starts his political career again.
In comparison with other politicians of the time, like Crassus and Pompey, Julius Caesar had a slow coming into power.
He generally does Roman politics like everybody else is doing Roman politics, which is bribe the hell out of everybody, do whatever you need to do to get ahead of everybody else, try to pay your way into popularity. He is in the populares faction, so there's two factions at this point: the optimates, who believe in the innate superiority of the aristocratic classes, and then there's the populares.
Julius Caesar actually belonged to this party who tried to support the lower classes or the middle class of Rome, which was impoverished at that time.
They will take their power by kind of geeing up the masses. They will give them bread and circuses, and then they will incite them to riot whenever they feel like they need to. He is one of the more corrupt and just really astoundingly corrupt politicians. He brags quite happily about the fact that he will bribe anybody. Eventually he works his way up.
Around 60 before Christ, he made a triumvirate with Pompeius and Crassus, who were the most important politicians at the time. That's when Julius Caesar started to become a central figure in Roman politics, not before that period. And then, just after that, he received the governorship of Gaul.
He gets to go off to Gaul, which is a really big commission.
That's when Julius Caesar started his ascension, into power, because he was able to conquer in a very short time an extremely large territory in the north of Italy, which is more or less what is today France and Switzerland, part of Belgium and part of Germany.
He goes off, just absolutely plunders it, practically genocides the people. He just wipes out almost the entire culture. He claims that he killed 1 million people and enslaved 1 million more, which is one hell of a thing to brag about.
He was able to cross the channel. He went into Britain for the first time. He was the first Roman to do that.
And then he turned around and looked at Rome. Pompey was his only competition at that time.
He was asked to relinquish the command of his armies and to return to the status of, let's say, private citizen. But Julius Caesar didn't accept this, so he tried to find a compromise with the Roman authorities, saying that if he was to relinquish his command over his armies, also Pompey had to relinquish his command. But the Roman authorities and the Senate didn't accept this.
He saw his enemies in Rome who were all saying that when he gave up his commission, he would be prosecuted for all of the terrible things that he had done, for all of the bribery, for all of the ways in which he had corrupted the state. So Julius decides that he does not want to be prosecuted. He does not believe that he should be prosecuted. He thinks he's right about everything all the time. His basic thought is, I brought you all of this glory and land. How dare you try to prosecute me for anything? So he says, if you don't promise you won't prosecute me, I am going to march on Rome. They say, that's ridiculous. The entire foundation of the Republic is that everybody is held accountable for their actions. And so he says, all right, and he takes his army and he marches across the Rubicon.
Julius Caesar was forced to cross the Rubicon, the famous, the die is cast, or whatever you want to say about that.
The full quote of the die is cast is, these actions are because of what the gods have decided and what the Senate have forced me to do. The die is cast. And he claims that they made him do it.
Finally, Julius Caesar was able to defeat Pompey.
Pompey has no army, so him and the Senate have to flee. Caesar chases them around basically the entire empire, eventually beats them. Pompey is killed in Egypt, at which point Caesar comes back to Rome, says, well done me, I saved us all from a civil war, aren't I good? I'm dictator now. Caesar is an autocratic leader from the very beginning. His first consulship, that's supposed to be a shared position where there's 2 consuls and they have to agree on everything. And people joked about the fact that Caesar just did what he wanted. He's a massive micromanager. Every part of the state, he is into it and he is fiddling about. When he comes back as a dictator and he decides he's going to redo the calendar in his own image and name a month after himself, like, that is unbelievably autocratic. And he never learns at any point that what all the Romans really want from him is to pretend that he's taking their opinion into account. In both the Roman sense of the word, in that he had the job, and in our modern sense of the word, he is a complete dictator.
He was also a military leader. That's what makes him look a little bit like a tyrant sometimes. This is the idea that Julius Caesar is the one who abolished the Roman Republic, and brought the Roman system from a democratic sort of system into a sort of monarchic system, which is the Roman Empire. But actually, the republic was a republic for the rich man. It was not a republic for the lower classes, So at least Julius Caesar was reforming society. So he was a progressive social leader from that point of view. There are some politicians who actually have affinities with Julius Caesar. The American great reformers, let's say Lincoln and Kennedy, both of them, they had ideas which were similar about society, at least.
He just thinks he's right about everything. He just is like, well, I'm right and I've got the best idea and I don't really care what anybody else thinks, so I'm just going to do it and then I'll tell you about it afterwards, which is the worst possible thing he could have been. And that, more than anything, is his problem and what gets him killed, which is that he won't allow anybody else the dignity and honour of the possibility that they might also have a say in how the state is run.
Julius Caesar was taking away freedom from the leading class, which is actually their privileges, but was giving it to the lower classes, actually. So these people liked Caesar, actually.
Because Caesar is such an autocratic leader, but also terrifying and quite popular among the people, certainly, of Rome. He keeps getting voted massive amounts of honours, which scare people. Particularly, they scare the other senators who see him being put higher and higher and higher on a pedestal. He has voted things like the right to call himself the father of the country, the right to wear his laurel leaves all the time and his triumphal robes. He has a statue among the old kings, and a statue of him is carried amongst the gods in processions. Sacrifices are made in his name. He is beginning to have himself put on a pedestal which is above mortals, and that is very frightening.
And that's when Julius Caesar was actually appointed as a permanent dictator.
In February 44, he makes himself dictator for life, and he takes away the possibility that they are ever going to get rid of him.
A dictator was somebody who was in power only in an emergency and only for the time of an emergency.
Every previous dictator had it for a year, had it for 2 years, and then stepped down.
They believed that Julius Caesar was introducing into Rome a new monarchy. You know that the first phase of Roman history was monarchic, no, with the kings, but then these kings were driven out, and the Romans couldn't accept the idea that a king was coming back.
And then there's a very famous incident at the Lupercalia, which involves all of the most prominent men running nude through the city, hitting women with sticks. But it ends with them all arriving in the Forum, and Mark Antony, who is his right-hand man, pulls out of somewhere. And I always like to think this because he's nude, he's completely naked, so where has he got it? He pulls out a crown and offers it to Caesar. Someone puts it on his head, and he waits to see how the crowd reacts. And eventually they're kind of against it, so he says, oh no, I won't be a king. But they see him with a crown on, and they have seen him acting as a monarch. And it seems like there is going to be no possible way that anything is going to go back to normal. And so people who opposed him in the past and people who were friends of his decide that something has to be done. And the only thing that can be done is to assassinate him. There's no other course of action. The three main conspirators are two people who were previously his enemies.
These were Brutus and Cassius, who had been fighting against Caesar originally in the Battle of Pharsalus.
They were strong supporters of Pompey, and they had been forgiven by Caesar.
Julius Caesar also gave them some important positions in his government.
Caesar, for all his many, many flaws, he was not a cruel man. And he was kind to his enemies. This is possibly a reason why you shouldn't forgive people who have fought against you in a war. And then the third is the Brutus, whose name is Decimus Junius Brutus. And he has been a supporter of Caesar's, a lieutenant of Caesar since the beginning. But when the dictator for life thing happens, when he starts to see crowns, people start calling on his supposed ancestor, who's the Brutus who overthrew the kings, and he feels somehow that he can no longer support Caesar. Assassination has become a legitimate political tool in Rome by this point for about 100 years. He's about to go to Parthia, and people start talking very seriously about how they're going to get rid of him, and there's a suggestion that they could push him off a bridge, which is quite good. There's a suggestion they could get a mob to attack him after he's been pushed off a bridge, just in case that doesn't work. Someone suggests that they could get him at the games because he will be out of his litter and walking around, so they could get gladiators to kill him. Eventually they decide that they are going to do it in the Senate while there is a Senate meeting, because one, they kind of hope that other senators might join in. Two, they want to make it clear that this is a political act, not a personal act, that this is an act to save the Republic. And three, it is a time when he will not be suspicious when people approach him, and they will be wearing their massive togas, and if they're wearing it, nobody will be able to spot that they've got swords underneath them. It's both ideological and practical decision to kill him in the Senate.
The actual assassination of Julius Caesar happened on March the 15th.
On the day of the assassination, which is the Ides of March, 44 BCE.
The conspirators actually took this occasion to kill Julius Caesar because Julius Caesar actually was about to leave Rome. His intention was to go to Alexandria in Egypt and begin a new campaign into the Middle East to conquer a new territory, through actually Mesopotamia and Persia, and probably to extend into India, because one of the main plans of Julius Caesar was that of rebuilding the empire of Alexander the Great.
Caesar has called a Senate meeting, and they've all decided that this is going to be the best time to do it, because if Caesar's called it, then he'll definitely be there. There are quite a lot of omens leading up. During the night, Calpurnia, who's his wife, has dreams that he's going to die or that the house is going to fall down. Caesar is looking like he's not going to go to the Senate that day because Romans are very religious, and even Caesar gets put off by a lot of bad dreams and auguries. And in two of the accounts that we've got, he's also been warned by a soothsayer that something bad is going to happen to him on the Ides of March. Eventually Decimus Brutus turns up and persuades him to go, says, everybody's waiting for you, you've called this, we've not got much time, we need to sort stuff out, so he goes along.
We are now very close to the location of Julius Caesar assassination in Largo Argentina. What we are seeing now are the so-called Republican temples of Largo Argentina, which were actually brought to light during the fascist regime era around 1926-27. So all these buildings which are visible now don't belong to the complex of buildings where Julius Caesar was assassinated. These buildings were actually in front of the theater of Pompey, which was an extremely complex series of buildings, including a semi-open space with roof and columns but without walls, which was the place where the Senate was meeting. We need to move to the area behind to see the location of the assassination of Julius Caesar.
The person who's called the Senate meeting has to do a sacrifice to make sure that the gods are okay with this meeting happening, and the gods are not okay with it. According to some of the later sources that we have, the sacrifice has no heart, which is a very bad sign. And he looks like he's going to go home again. And Brutus again has to convince him to go in and say, look, you're Caesar, what do you care about the gods, basically?
It seems that Mark Antony was kept outside the Senate House because they were afraid that he could actually help Caesar.
He does enter. He goes and sits in his big fancy chair. A guy called Tullius Cimbra grabs Caesar. He starts by asking for mercy for his brother, who Caesar has unilaterally exiled for whatever reason. Caesar brushes him off, so he grabs Caesar's toga. No one has touched Caesar without his permission for many, many years, and he is unhappy about that. Some of the sources say that he is grabbing the toga to hold him down in his seat, and some say that he is doing it to expose his neck, because what happens next, a guy called Servilius Casca stabs him. He either stabs him from behind and it comes in here into his shoulder, or he stabs him and it comes in kind of here. This is where the accounts split off slightly. Everybody agrees that Casca is the first person to stab and it's somewhere in the neck area, but Caesar's reaction changes quite a lot depending on really whether sources liked him or not. The earliest version was written about 20 or 30 years later by a guy called Nicolaus of Damascus, who was writing for Octavian, who is Julius Caesar's heir. He tells quite a detailed version where as soon as he's stabbed, Caesar jumps up and is immediately piled on. He doesn't have a chance to react, he doesn't do anything, he is just immediately knocked to the ground and is stabbed all over about 30 times, and he says that it looks like a brawl where all of the conspirators are fighting over hitting Caesar's body. He's quite specific and says that he's stabbed in the side, that Decimus Brutus hits him in the thigh, and that Cassius swipes him across the face. And then he falls to the ground and is stabbed by a frenzy of people trying to all stab him as much as possible. The second version is Suetonius, who is writing a biography of Julius Caesar about 150 years later, about 100 CE, and he says that as soon as Caesar is stabbed, he stabs Casca's hand with his stylus. So while Casca still has his dagger stuck in him, he stabs his hand. He then tries to jump up, but because he sees how many people are pulling swords and daggers out, he loses heart and his focus becomes on trying to maintain his dignity. So he tries to cover his head, he tries to cover his legs. What he says is in Greek, kai su teknon, which means you too, my son. And then he dies kind of covering himself as like a little huddled animal. The third version is Plutarch, who's writing about the same time as Suetonius. It's about 150 years later. He's writing a biography of Julius Caesar and trying to make it a parallel to Alexander the Great. In his version, Caesar basically says, "What the hell are you doing?" And he's furious, and he holds onto the dagger that is stuck into him, which causes Casca to have to call for help. In this version, Caesar is surrounded but fights back really hard until Brutus stabs him in the groin, at which point he goes down, and then when he sees Decimus Brutus, that's when he loses heart and he pulls his toga over his head and gives up. The fourth version comes from Appian, who is writing about 180 years later and is writing a history of the civil wars of the late Republic. And in this version, which is my favourite version, Caesar grabs Casca as he stabs him and throws him across the room. And as he throws him, he leaves his side open and he is stabbed through the side. He then repeats what Suetonius says, which is that he's stabbed in the thigh by Brutus and he's stabbed in the face by Cassius, and that he is thrown around. He's described as a wild beast. He sees that Decimus Brutus has a knife and he loses heart, he covers his face and he goes down. The interesting thing, I think, about all of those different versions is only in one that he speaks. And he says in Greek, "You too, my child," not in Latin. But in all of the rest of them, he's silent.
According to a very recent article, scholars made the hypothesis that the actual spot where Julius Caesar was wounded, mortally wounded by the conspirators, is actually this bus stop here. We have to imagine that the Curia of Pompey, this space in which they had the meetings of the Senate, was actually located across the street here. Not much of the ancient spot is visible today, but this is the actual location of the assassination.
Immediate aftermath of it is that the city is kind of shocked.
There was an extreme confusion in Rome.
They don't really know what to do or how to function without Caesar.
The supporters of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony and Lepidus, were, it seems, very afraid of being assassinated themselves. So it seems that they actually went into hiding.
But it very much seems like everything is going to gradually continue as normal and that the conspirators are going to get what they wanted.
The supporters of Julius Caesar, they decided to forgive the killers of Julius Caesar, but at the same time to keep all the, plans that Julius Caesar had set for its government.
Mark Antony eventually gets the Senate to agree that they will give him a state funeral. There is quite a lot of argument about whether they should remember him as a tyrant who was killed and therefore try to cut his memory out of Roman history, or whether they should remember him as the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest, and the dictator of Rome who was killed, and therefore give him a state funeral and act like it was a tragedy. Eventually they come to a sort of truce where they will give him this state funeral, but they won't make too much of a fuss after that.
But later on, at the funeral of Julius Caesar, according to the historians, Mark Antony gave a speech which actually raised, the rage of the crowd.
Mark Antony does rile everybody up by showing everybody his toga at the funeral, covered in blood, which kind of annoys people.
So Brutus and Cassius, they were actually driven out of Rome.
And then what happens is a couple of months afterwards, this guy comes to town called Gaius Octavianus, and he says, I am Julius Caesar's great nephew. He adopted me in his will. I have all of his money and all of his power. He says he's going to take revenge. Octavian is 19 years old, and he basically marches into Rome and says, I'm not standing for this. I'm going to raise my own army and take them to war against Brutus and Cassius. They say, you can't do that, you're not a consul, you're not allowed an army. He says, all right, make me consul. And literally sends in men with swords into the Senate house, and they say, we will literally kill you if you don't make him consul. And then Octavian rampages across the empire. He chases Cassius and Brutus and the other conspirators, and he is the person who is willing to completely destroy everything that Rome technically stands for in order to, one, take vengeance, and two, increase his own power and authority. And that really is what brings down the Republic. It's usually said that it's Caesar's murder that ends the Republic, but Octavian, who later becomes Augustus and then becomes the first emperor, has no time or patience and is genuinely terrifying, and he completely destroys the Republic.
This emphasis on the assassination of Julius Caesar actually derives from, first of all, from the sources, all written at a later stage. Also in the literature, Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, all the action now is centered on the assassination of Julius Caesar. And that's why we have this idea, that the assassination is actually so important in his life. But I don't think that's what actually fixed his legacy. It's much more, his activity as a politician. Probably at the time of Julius Caesar, they didn't feel anything like that.
Caesar's legacy is secured by the fact that he adopts Octavian, and it's Octavian's ability to come in after the assassination and take vengeance, which really shapes how we see Julius Caesar today, because Octavian is obviously very successful. He destroys everybody who tries to stand up to him. He destroys Cassius and Brutus, and then he destroys Antony as well. And because of that, he's the winner, and he gets to say who is the baddie and who is the goodie. He makes Caesar a god, a literal god. There's a whole thing about a comet going up and somebody saying that that's Caesar's soul. So he is made literally divine. Then Octavian shapes his entire identity around the fact that he is the son of the divine murdered Julius Caesar, and he is able to create this whole story whereby Caesar is the sadly murdered victim.
In the end, the leadership of Julius Caesar, or the ideas of Julius Caesar, survived through Octavian. His ideas as a new political leader actually prevailed in Rome.
Caesar's writings of himself as the great military commander of Rome mean that he is an idol to military dictators, basically, the kind of people who want to civilize the world and make themselves the master of the universe. He is an idol to people like Napoleon.
Napoleon was also a social reformer. He was influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution and was a very important military leader. but he was defeated, something that didn't happen to Julius Caesar. He was never defeated in battle. Only people who were organizing a conspiracy against him were able to kill him.
They don't heed the warning, though. They never seem to get to the end of the story, which is that everybody hated him and then they stabbed him to death. Largely because he portrays himself so well in his writings that it seems impossible that that could happen to him. So he wrote 2 books, and they were considered to be, by everybody, even people who hated Caesar as a person, perfect examples of Latin literature. And even down to today, you will find A-level or GCSE Latin students in nice schools around the country reading Caesar's Gallic War and coming to know Caesar only as the way that he portrayed himself. He presents himself in the third person as an untouchable genius, and because of that, he is able to shape his own legacy into the modern day as not as a genocidal leader who completely rampages over entire civilizations in order to advance his own personal goals in Rome, but as a glorious and brilliant military leader who brings civilization to the savages. And that is still the legacy that he has today, largely because he's really good at writing Latin. I've had a lot of people talking to me about Julius Caesar because the main way that he took sole power was by refusing to give up when he had come to the end of his term. And what he did instead was send in an army to create violence in the centre of Rome in order to make sure that he didn't have to. And we have just seen that happen on a much, much smaller scale with the Senate riots in America and the refusal of Trump to admit that he lost an election. And had Trump had more of a terrifying ego and a backbone, then we might have seen something much, much worse. For the people who lived through what Caesar was doing, he did the Senate riots on a scale of 1 million. He took a trained army into Rome so that he didn't have to give up his power and give it to somebody else who legitimately owned it. Everything that you think is stable and holds a state or an empire together is actually very, very fragile. It only takes one person to refuse to play by the rules to show that it is based on agreement that the rules matter.
Julius Caesar may appear as a dictator, as a military commander, so in a sense, a sort of right-wing figure, because he imposed his ideas with his military power. But on the other side, Julius Caesar was a social reformer who introduced a lot of new ideas in Roman society. So from this point of view, Julius Caesar actually appeared to be like a progressive leader today. He's somewhere in the middle. If I have to say my personal opinion, I think in the end Julius Caesar is mostly a progressive leader. His attitude with his soldiers was extremely democratic, something that other leaders didn't do before him, and the soldiers loved him. Julius Caesar actually relied on the people from the lower classes.
He, in my opinion, is a dangerous figure to idolize because the main thing about Julius Caesar is he does what he wants when he wants to, and he doesn't care what anybody else thinks about him. He cannot be constrained by the normal rules of political or religious or moral behavior.
It's a very complex, complicated figure. It's not easy to define him, in a way or another.